Good afternoon. My name is Nicoletta Piereddu. I'm the inaugural director of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative, and on behalf of all my colleagues, I wish to welcome you to the art and craft of podcasts, teaching, learning, researching. This is the second event of our Humanities in Action series, aiming to promote on-campus conversations about different forms of engagement and outreach for humanities pedagogy and scholarship, trying to go beyond the classroom and the classic single-authored monograph. We had a first panel on academics and public writing in September, and another one is coming up on November 17th, devoted to digital humanities. The updated list of topics and participants is being finalized, and I will circulate it very soon. So I hope you can join us also in November. So podcasting, 15 years after Apple first offered over 3,000 free podcasts on iTunes, the medium has, we can say, become mainstream. According to Edison Research, there are now 62 million Americans listening to podcasts every week. And apparently they have the embarrassment of choice. Over 800,000 active podcasts with over 54 million podcast episodes are currently available worldwide. Big media, but also leading content providers have entered the podcast industry. Even Barack and Michelle Obama agreed to make a series of podcasts on Spotify because, as the former president said, quote, podcasts offer an extraordinary opportunity to foster productive dialogue, make people smile and make people think, and hopefully bring us all a little closer together. Given the popularity of this medium, tonight we wish to explore some of the ways in which podcasting is being used on campus to support and enrich teaching, learning, and research in higher education, and to promote forms of student-faculty collaborations that blend scholarship and pedagogy. The following members of the Georgetown community will share their experiences with us tonight from different areas of the humanities. Sarah McNamer, professor of English and Medieval Studies and director of the Global Medieval Studies program. Her core area of expertise is Middle English literature, but she has also published in Italian medieval literature and the history of emotion. She teaches courses ranging from Chaucer to English literary history to critical approaches to world literature. And at present, she's teaching an Ignatius seminar called Pre-Modern Worlds, A History Through Literature and the Arts. And her experience with podcasts derives precisely from this seminar. Tonight, she will focus in particular on making podcasts about medieval Africa. Ishaan, a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service, planning to major in international politics. In his freshman year, he was part of Professor Sarah McNamer's Ignatius Seminar, where the class crafted a podcast on a museum artifact as part of their final project. Outside of class, Ishaan contributes to the Hoya and Caravel newspapers. Emma Moswer, a second-year Ph.D. student in the Department of History. Her research focuses on the connection between climate change, agricultural practice, and scientific and cultural understandings of the natural world in pre-industrial Northern Britain. She has worked for environmental nonprofits, advocating sustainable agriculture and policy, and since 2019, together with her advisor, Professor Dagomar de Groot, she has co-hosted the podcast Climate History, which will be the framework of her reflections tonight on podcasting the past, present, and future of climate change. Robynn Stilwell, trained as a musicologist, she teaches in the music and film and media studies programs. She works primarily on music in multimedia, dance, theater, film, and television, and is currently working on a book on podcasts, radio, and audiobooks, specifically thinking about how sound conjures space, image, and movement in purely oral media. We all look forward to Professor Steelwell's reflection on shaping time and space through sound. Our moderator is Meg Oakley, Director of Copyright and Scholarly Communication at the Georgetown University Library since 2014. She provides information and guidance to Georgetown faculty, staff, and students on matters relating to copyright and scholarly publishing. Meg is also chair of the Scholarly Communication Committee. Prior to her position, she was head of reference and associate law librarian for public services at the Georgetown Law Library. She was also adjunct professor at Georgetown Law, teaching advanced legal research classes. And prior to that, she was a reference librarian and lecturer in law at Duke Law. Our panel is structured as a conversation and encourages also questions from the audience. So please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A feature. We will address them towards the end of our event, approximately the last 15 minutes after our panelist conversation. Thank you very much. I leave the floor to our moderator, Meg Oakley. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicoletta. I'm just delighted to be here this evening with these panelists. And I think the best thing that I can do right now is just get to the panelists and start this conversation. So Sarah, you have been using podcasts as assignments in your global medieval studies classes. I was wondering if you could explain to us why you decided to use podcasts as an assignment, and what skills or experiences you'd like the students to develop through a podcast.
So thank you. I've used these in the Ignatius Seminar context. And first I want to say that institutional structures and initiatives are really important for this. And the Ignatius Seminar allows one to sort of wander and experiment in these wonderful ways. So I taught for the first time a course that was centered around objects last year. My primary field is literature, but we focused on objects, had a lot of excursions to area museums, in part because I was inspired by the podcast series, The History of the World in 100 Objects, that was produced by Neil McGregor of the British Museum and by the BBC, because within 20 minutes, you can look at a particular object, hear it described to you, and learn so much about the world in a very short space of time. So I wanted to do that with my students, and I think it has been very successful so far. I'm doing it again this year. I think one of the advantages is that it can be a supplement to the other work that we do in class. I would never want to forego the kind of quiet, reflective experience of writing papers or constructing a really compelling argument. But one of the advantages of working with this medium is first, that it doesn't need to be an argument, that there are other ways of learning and conveying information, and the podcast format allows for that, for becoming curious about something, leading your listeners into that experience and conveying something important. I also think that medieval studies, the medieval world has a PR problem in that so many are either feel daunted and feel that it's a daunting subject, or there are associations with the barbaric or the simple or the primitive and all of these things. So one of the things that we're seeking to do, again, in a very short podcast, is open up these worlds that are so rich and interesting and compelling. So the podcast is a really ideal form for that. And I think the last thing I would just say is that the human voice is really such an interesting feature of humanity. If we think of the humanities and of human beings as storytelling creatures, there's actually a performer of the medieval epic, the Sunjata, who performs the oral history of the Mande peoples through the Sunjata. And when asked, well, why don't you have a written form of this epic? He said, why would you ever want that when you could have the warmth of the human voice, which conveys not only the content, but a kind of, it invites affective engagement and the experience of the senses. So those are some reasons why I've engaged with this project.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. I'd like to turn next to Ishaan, who was a student in Sarah's class and actually created one of these podcasts. And Ishaan, I was wondering if you could tell us as a student, what was your initial reaction to being asked to create a podcast instead of a more traditional assignment, particularly in a humanities class, which would normally be some kind of paper or reflection? How did you go about thinking about your podcast, and literally, how did you go about making it? And do you feel that you got sort of a different experience working with your topic by doing a podcast instead of a traditional assignment?
Sure, yeah. So, yeah, I would definitely agree with the professor in you know, it acts as a perfect, addition to, other assignments like an essay and such. So just first going on to my initial reaction, obviously initially when Professor McNamer, said, okay, our final assignment for this class is going to be a podcast, I was a little definitely surprised, and, maybe it seemed a bit daunting, how were we going to do this? Because, it seemed like a podcast seems like such a complex thing to do. But, when we actually start to get into it, I realized it actually wasn't so bad. To actually make it, we used GarageBand, which is the music app that comes with every MacBook. So, it's a music app, but it turned out it worked perfectly for, just a straight podcast as well. So I think, as a professor touched on, it really allows you to access certain skills that, you wouldn't be able to engage with just with a normal paper. The aspect of, the human voice, right? We had to spend a lot of time thinking about sound quality, how were we able to get our voice sounding well. So we had to get, the right microphones from the library. The lounger is very helpful in that. And also mixing music as well was a big part of it. So we had to figure out, how to, mixing music in the background to sort of, augment and sort of catch the listener, so to speak, and, mixing it, making sure it didn't overpower your voice, making sure to make sure it wasn't copyrighted music. So I think all these aspects, as the professor said, it acts as a really nice complement to an essay, and just it's a really unique way of engaging with the material, specifically historical object. I did it was basically an ivory hunting horn from Sierra Leone. It was in the African Museum, the Smithsonian in DC. So that, that was the object I engaged with, and I think it was a really informative way to do it as opposed to just a normal essay.
Great, thanks for sharing your experiences with us. I'd like to turn next to Emma, who's been working on the Climate History podcast and has co-hosted 8 recent episodes of that. So Emma, you're using the podcast as a way to communicate some very important scientific and interdisciplinary information on climate change. And I was wondering if you could explain to us how you work with your guests who are experts in a range of subjects that are unknown to most of us, from paleoclimatology to law, so that they be able to communicate their research in a way that's understandable and engaging for a public audience. And if you could also maybe describe a little bit why you choose a podcast to do that as opposed to some of the other media that are available.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's convenient, starting out speaking with experts in other fields, because I can genuinely ask a lot of questions to which I don't know the answer about the paleo sciences and climate change, or law and climate change, because those aren't my areas of expertise. So questions, when they're coming in an interdisciplinary or a multidisciplinary conversation, really come from a place of genuine curiosity. And our guests, who come from a range of of fields can share their expertise with us, and we're listening to them, for the first time, as well as our listeners. So we can really start from the ground up in the conversations that we have with them, and ask them to tell a story about their research and how their research can help us know more about the past, and by extension, the present and the future of climate change. So I think to get to the second part of your question as well, there's a real benefit in the podcast medium, because it really removes a lot of the barriers that are in place for getting a lot of this information. To open up a scientific journal or a law journal, or to attend a conference isn't something that's accessible to everyone, especially if they're not involved in that particular field. So the podcast medium allows for those barriers to be taken away, and we get more of the same conversation. So we typically structure our interviews by asking about the nature of the research that our guest does, whether that's tree ring research or social science research that involves interviews and ethnography. And from there, we can get into some examples of their work, which generally leads to really compelling stories, not only about their findings, but also about the process of, the travel, the field work that goes into their research. And we do typically finish up our interviews by asking, what does this mean for the future? What does your research about the past tell us about where we might be headed, or what actions we might be able to take? So there's a real bringing that research, which might be kind of esoteric, if encountered in a more academic setting, into a framework that's more accessible for someone who doesn't necessarily have a background. So my hope is that someone can begin an episode about dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, or the study of a particular history, not knowing much about the topic, and by the end have learned something about not only the past of climate change, but how we know what we know and what we can do with that knowledge going forward.
Great, thank you. It's really a fascinating subject area to be able to translate that into this content that's accessible to the public. I found it very engaging. So the next question is for Robynn. And I know you've used podcasts in teaching, but I'd like to ask you to comment on another way that you've studied podcasts, about analyzing the podcast from a scholarly perspective, with particular attention to the role of music and sound in the podcast. I was wondering if you could describe that a little more, and also tell us a little bit about how some of the information and research that you conducted might be able to help somebody who's more of an entry-level podcaster without high-end equipment and technical support put together a more compelling podcast by using sound and music effectively.
Yeah. Well, I just want to echo something that Ishaan said earlier, which is that getting the balance right is actually really tricky. It's easier. It sounds easier than it actually is. And it can depend on, there are a number of different elements to it. I have also done video essays, which are closely related to podcasts, but have a visual element. And I found that I can get away with kind of, I hesitate to use the word sloppy, but less precise oral content if I've got visuals. If I don't, I have to be much more careful. For instance, I will talk over music if I've got a visual. I will not do that if it's oral only. It makes a huge difference. Now, you said low end or high end. These days, things like GarageBand, Audacity, There are a number of programs that you can use that are very, very simple, but actually as powerful as what, you used to have to go into a recording studio to access not even that long ago. So you can get a really nice sounding podcast without a whole lot of outlay if you've got like a MacBook Pro like I'm on right now, and a decent microphone. Although you never know. I was using a fancy microphone and for some reason I couldn't get the volume high enough to talk over some things that I wanted to talk over. And I didn't actually want to take the sound down more because then you start to introduce distortion into the music. So I needed to get over that. And I found out kind of by accident that all I had to do was unplug my fancy microphone and use the computer and just talk to the computer. So, playing around with that can be very effective. There are just some things that we know from the interaction of music and other things that are always useful. Very simple music and sound can have a tremendous effect. Just the introduction of a drone creates what Michel Chion calls a forward vector. It's like we know we're going somewhere and we can tell that there's a direction, but we don't really know what that is. You add a rhythm to that, and then you've got a sense of how fast you're going. So there's some really simple musical profiles that can be used to shape things. If you want to slow something down, make the music fast. If you want to speed it up, make the music slow. There are these kind of counterintuitive things. But again, this idea that I can't remember if it was Sarah or Ishaan brought up is that you're not giving information in the same way that you would be in a paper, right? You have a great deal of, you can create a lot of density in a paper. Goodness knows I have been criticized for the density of some of the things I've written. And doing it orally actually makes you step back. And there's this kind of intermediate step that we have, this like the conference paper. And if you've ever given a conference paper and listened to it, a friend of mine calls it the trailer, that the conference paper is just the trailer for the movie, which is the real article. But the trailer is what draws you in, right? It's what gets you there. And I feel like a podcast is almost like the trailer for the trailer, or it's the deleted scenes or something. It's something extra. It's not necessarily giving you as much density or even as much depth, but it gives you an essence. It can give you a feeling over things. I do not assign podcasts for students, but I make it a possibility. And I've noticed that over the past 3 or 4 years, I've taught classes that focus on musicals so that there are performance aspects to it. And students often pick that as a choice for performance because they can articulate ideas about performance, which are really, really hard to talk about. And so there are certain things that we do as humans, speaking of the human voice, that we all know when we hear it, but we don't know how to talk about it. And musicians are even bad about talking about it because we don't talk about it. But by using an oral medium, you can articulate that. So we've been talking about objects, but what is the musical object? Is it the sheet music? Is it a performance? Is it a record? I mean, this has actually been quite a debate over the past 50 years. So there are ways in which sound can let us into that. And then at the other end of the spectrum, I'm working as a researcher, looking at podcasts which are sonically rich. Radiolab, for instance, is probably the one that people are used to, S-Town. But I'm also going back and looking at radio and listening to Edward R. Murrow's broadcasts from the London Blitz, and the way that he makes the combination of the sound that is there, that is live sound, because they weren't allowed not to use live sound. It had to be live sound. But the way that he could articulate things that creates a sonic event out of his voice and how that works. Or Orson Welles' radio program, The Shadow, where he has to, it's a radio program and he has to evoke invisibility. I mean, think about that. That's a lot of richness. And so I was already doing that. And then last September, a very famous guitarist and songwriter, well, famous is maybe not the right word, influential, let's put him that way, named Robbie Robertson, who wrote like The Wait and The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down and all of these sort of classic songs. He's moved into film music, and he did this song on his most recent album where he sings about the experience of listening to the shadow and listening to him be invisible and the effect on that of him as a child. And so the layers of kind of sonic experience in that, I think are really, I mean, I think that's really pushing the borders of what you can do, but you can do that. It would not be as interesting to make a little movie of that, but to make the oral experience. And so from creating the oral experience to evoking the oral experience to just talking in a way that imparts information in a different way than writing could, I think oral media has a lot more to offer. And we kind of did, jump from radio to television and film and kind of not pay attention to radio at all. And it's kind of like now that podcasts are popular, people are starting to go back and look at radio. And I absolutely believe that's the main reason why radio studies suddenly started to kick up in the late aughts. Because I'd always wondered, why aren't people talking about it? I'm like, because they didn't have a context for it. And now we do.
Great. Thank you so much. Do any of our panelists have any comments or questions for the other panelists, but based on these opening remarks? Well, I'd like to just, before we go deeper into some of those issues, just talk about podcasts as a research tool, as researching was one of the topics in the title of this, The Art and Craft of Podcast, Teaching, Learning, and Researching. So we talked a little bit about teaching and learning, as well as actually the logistics of creating the podcast. But in terms of using podcasts as a research tool, most of the conversation that we've had so far has been about podcasts as a communication tool, either in the classroom or directly to the public. So are podcasts an effective research tool for you? And in what ways might students or scholars use podcasts to further their research? Or would it be more appropriate to think of this as a way to communicate with various communities?
I have one response to that, which is that for my students, I have required them to interview an expert as part of their research. So the research process has really been interesting, I think, for these podcasts. First, because of our wonderful librarians at Lowinger, Melissa Jones and Sandra Hussey and Meg, being able to advise students on how to think about copyright and permissions and how to find a peer-reviewed source for this or for that. So the librarians who have helped with us with the research project have been really wonderful for this. But also I have asked students to interview an expert in the field. And that's another form of research that I want them to encounter, to be very curious about something, meet someone who knows so much about it, and have that really direct communication with that person. So at least that's my hope, is that that will be really a very energizing and inspiring thing for my students. And it also adds texture to the podcast. So we're trying to think a little bit more about the audio texture, but also intellectual texture. So mostly these are kept on the level of very clear communication, but it's okay and good to sort of move into a different mode where the language is it does include terms of art and particular technical terms, and really reveals the expertise that especially the professors and curators that my students have interviewed are bringing to the table here. So we're looking for that, but I think that direct experience of interviewing an expert, I think as Emma was saying, that's such an essential part of many podcasts, and that is, I think, a really exciting part of the experience of doing research.
Thank you. Ishaan, as a student, how did you feel about doing primary research yourself with an expert? Maybe you could tell us who you interviewed for your podcast, and how did that compare to, doing research in the library and databases or print materials?
Yeah, so I think, I would definitely agree with Professor McNamer. I think the interview opportunity was, that is such a central part of, modern podcasts. And I think engaging with that was definitely, it was a cool idea. And so for mine, I interviewed Katherine De Luna. So she's a professor of African history, I believe. So basically, so I think, as Professor McNamer mentioned earlier, a big part of our project was, so we focus on medieval times, medieval artifacts, was sort of bringing the medieval ages, to light, because I think we sort of have these maybe, not very clear perceptions of the Middle East, or a lot of of the medieval ages, sorry, and we have a lot of misperceptions, that there as the Dark Ages, it was sort of isolated. And in particular, mine object being an African object, of course, we have tons of misconceptions about Africa being sort of an isolated and dark continent at the time. And so my object particularly, it's from West Africa, but it was traded into Portugal and Spain, and it made the rounds in Europe. So when I interviewed Professor De Luna, I basically talked about this idea of, we think of Africa as sort of this area that has been cut off from the modern world for so long. And, it's only recently come to light, but I think my object sort of showed the opposite of that. And Professor De Luna sort of talked about, that idea of Africa as dark was sort of brought in as a, colonial idea to justify imperialism and such. So I think, having that professor interview sort of allowed me to basically augment the central thesis of my podcast, let's say. So I think just tying that all up into the research aspect, it really helps augment that.
And Emma, you had mentioned that you were learning from these experts in various interdisciplinary areas related to climate change. Has any of the the information that you've gotten from the research or from the experts that you've interviewed informed the research or of the Climate History Project or future podcasts, or has it more been a communication tool?
Yeah, I would say for me, the podcast has been a really fantastic tool as a very junior scholar to get to chat with people who are leaders in their fields from other universities and from other institutions whom I might not otherwise have the opportunity to meet and speak with, is just such a privilege for me as someone who interviews and gets to chat with these folks. And when Dagmar de Groot began the podcast, he was also still in graduate school when he founded it. So the podcast functions uniquely, I think, as a tool for junior scholars to do things and make connections that might be more difficult without the podcast format. So I'm looking forward to this forming, the basis for potentially future research collaborations, and certainly ideas for my own research. I'm so fortunate to be here at Georgetown learning from so many multidisciplinary experts in the fields I'm interested in, but to have, the opportunity to gain inspiration and insight into the work that I'm doing from these other people as well, is really helpful. So I think, there is the sort of first and foremost thing that we think about podcasts is definitely as a communication tool, and especially one that is accessible to a general audience. But I think something that doesn't get discussed as much, and I'm glad that we're talking about it now, is the fact that communication between scholars is so important, especially across disciplines. And for a podcast to facilitate that, I think raises really exciting new research questions, especially in a dynamic multidisciplinary field like climate history.
Thank you. So building on that a little bit, I'm wondering if any of you would be able to comment on the possibility that maybe podcasts would allow us to maybe form some new or different communities around scholarly interests, particularly in the humanities, by allowing new voices and more diverse voices into the conversation. Traditionally, the barrier to entry into the humanities communities is pretty high in terms of the journals and the books that have to go through editors and peer reviews and everything. That it takes a long time, and there's obviously more people who want to be in those conversations than are allowed in by the current system. So is there if you could just talk a little bit maybe about your own experiences with this, or how in the future we might be able to have different conversations in different communities than the current scholarly communication system is set up for.
So I have a perspective on that, which is that we in medieval studies moved to global medieval studies a few years ago, and that has been really a way to build community across our campus. And we've seen that happening in lots of ways. But I see the podcasts as furthering that effort to go beyond Europe when thinking about medieval period. So we've created this website through the help of the library at Georgetown Domain's website, where we have the podcasts from last year, including Ishaan's, available there. But I've imagined that as something that could be expanded in many ways. So it's just called Pre-Modern Worlds, and it could be podcasts that are offered by anyone, not only my students for this class, but for others, for other students, for other faculty from Georgetown and from the wider area. So I see that as a way to invite more voices in and to really spark interest, because I think when students can listen to something for 10 minutes, 12 minutes and recognize, oh, that's such an interesting field of study, and that professor teaches here at Georgetown, and so on. I think that can really be part of this, work of engagement and outreach that you mentioned earlier, Nicoletta, that it's a really good form for that. I'm just reminded here, I'm seeing in the Q&A, Howard Spendolo was one of the professors that one of my students interviewed last year. And I'm glad to know that that was a positive experience for the professors as well as the students. So even that kind of dimension of community building with professors being asked to give an interview as an expert, I think can be a good one.
It's Robynn.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on that as we started about talking about this as, reaching across disciplines, right? Reaching to people in far-flung places. But especially right now, I think we shouldn't underestimate the ability to reach across to the person in the desk next to you. I've been using a lot more peer review in the last couple of years among my students, and also making something like a podcast an option. And more people are picking it up. And I'm hoping that it's almost priming you to talk, right? Because people are used to writing, and they can't talk about things as well. But the podcast actually makes you talk and makes you learn how to articulate these ideas that you have in a relatively concise way, and also figure out strategies of how can I get X amount of information out in a specific amount of time. And we are taught strategies to do that with writing. And that's one of the reasons writing ends up so dense, or it can. but the impulse is kind of the opposite when you're doing something oral and linear. And I mean oral, and linear in terms of the podcast. And so I feel like it can also be really useful as teacher to student. I've mentored a student who is doing a podcast in China. And, you know, what are the strategies to setting up an interview, et cetera. So I think while it's tempting at first to think really large, and I think that's really exciting, I think we shouldn't neglect the idea of keeping it local as well. It's just, I mean, the difference between radio and podcasting is time shifting, right? So it's a way of time shifting a conversation in some ways, or it could be.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I know when I was doing some research a couple of years ago on a podcasting program that we had done through the Scholarly Communication Committee, I found that the information on radio, particularly from NPR, was so directly applicable to podcasting. And we actually had a speaker from NPR come as one of our panelists, and the connection there is great. So there's a lot of information out there from NPR and other sources on how to do radio, and it feeds right into the podcast. So Ishaan, you had talked about your podcast being relating to an object, and Robynn, earlier you had talked about video, sorry, I'm forgetting the word, videos.
Video essay?
Video essay, thank you. I was going with video story, but I knew that wasn't right. I was wondering if anybody would care to comment on the relationship between, you know, objects in visual materials and the podcast, how you see those two things working together. Yes, Robynn.
I was just suddenly struck by this idea of the object. And there was this TV show that I occasionally put on in the background. It was called Mysteries at the Museum. And they would always start with an object, and it would be tell some little historical oddity or something. And they would start to describe the object before they would show it. And so you would get things like it's 6 inches long and it's got, you know, it's got this metal thing attached to it or whatever. And it would draw you in and you're like, what are they describing? And then when you would see it, you would go, oh, but in the meantime, it had generated all of this imagination of what could that possibly be at the beginning. And so I think that the idea of having an image that is being described and the way in which you describe it, I go back to Murrow and the Blitz things. That's not an object, but it's a space. And the way that he manages with very few words to actually place himself, you can actually see the place he's at, not just in a kind of two-dimensional map like, but you can see like the searchlights and you can see the planes and you've got this really strong perspectivized image in your head from the way he's describing where he's at and what he can see. And yeah, we talk about that in literary events, but it seems so much more potent when you're actually hearing it unfold in time. So I think that the act of describing things that you think, well, just slap up a picture. Sometimes that's not the best way to get, to go back to The Shadow. What's fascinating about The Shadow would be a boring TV show. It's the imagination of him as invisible that's more potent than actually seeing it.
I think I would just add to that my students, and Ishaan's podcast is especially good at this, I think. They were asked to describe the object, but to do so in engaging terms. So to come back again to that word, Nicoletta, of engagement. So to use a shared pronoun. So let's go closer to this object. Here we are in the Museum of African Art. It looks pretty simple from a distance, but let's go closer, you know, that kind of thing. And then a kind of curious and appreciative language that can involve the audience, not only in visualizing something, but doing that with an appreciation for its affective impact on the viewer. So again, Ishaan's is really good at this, I think, with, you know, this is mesmerizing, this is striking, stunning, you know, to use those kinds of adjectives again is, I think, really helpful in engaging an audience. And it's also something you can't really do in a paper, you know, an academic critical essay. Usually that kind of affective language is set aside, but here it's very appropriate and it engages the listener and it lets them share that experience of encountering the object. So that's one of the great advantages, I think, of the medium. And I guess to just add to that, there have been studies about how literary texts create images in our minds through descriptive language. So for the students to learn how to do that, how to produce images in the minds of their listeners, you know, is, I think, it's mimicking a lot of what literary texts do. So I think that's another, you know, benefit to using this medium.
Can I just briefly add, we've talked a lot about seeing and hearing, but the podcast also allows us to talk about feel, sensation. What does this feel like? What does it smell like? Even possibly, what does it taste like? You know, so in other words, there's something about the medium, I think, that's a little bit more relaxed and allows us to talk about things like that would be considered a little bit extraneous in the traditions of scholarly writing that we have, even though I would argue they're still really important, but they're often kind of discouraged.
Thank you. We have some time for questions from the audience. If anybody would like to submit a question through the Q&A, please go ahead and do that. We have one right now. And maybe Ishaan, you'd be the right person to answer this question first, at least. I'm wondering how much instruction professors give to students regarding podcasts. Do you expect them to learn GarageBand on their own? Can you let us know how you actually went ahead and created your podcast? You talked about it a little bit, but maybe where you got help and how, what kind of support you got from Professor McNamer and the library, and how much you did on your own?
Sure. Yeah. So we definitely got a good amount of help when crafting the podcast, particularly from the library. And so during, you know, a few times in our class, we would go to the library, and specifically the people at the Georgetown Media Center, I believe, they would basically, you know, talk to us about, you know, things like sound, and obviously also talk about, you know, researching books and such. But, you know, all of us, we were basically able to make an appointment with one of the Georgetown people. And basically they were able to walk us through, you know, how to use GarageBand, you know, how to turn it to the record rather than just the music functions that play the electronic instruments. It would play the, you know, how to switch it to the recording function, and how to hook up certain microphones to your computer. So yeah, we definitely got a lot of guidance in that respect, particularly from the library during class.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I was so relieved to learn about all of the help support, you know, provided by the library. So I thought it would be out of the question for me to teach a class and assign podcasts as the main goal of either the research project. Because I'm not good with technology. And so but I found very quickly that, you know, once again, the library is there to help. And Georgetown was wonderful about suggesting things like, so I had a meeting with one of the members of the Georgetown staff who said, yes, you need to put interim guidelines here, have them do a trial audio by a certain date, then add this. So you break it down and then it can be completed over the course of the semester. So that was really helpful to me, that I essentially was able to outsource the technical part because I don't have that expertise. But I had used GarageBand myself and for other sort of recordings of having to do with my work. So I'd had some familiarity with GarageBand, but I wasn't doing a hands-on sort of guiding of the students. And this semester too, my student course assistant is really working with the technical aspects of that. So that's how I've handled that
Emma, can you let us know how you create your podcast, which is not in a classroom, but it is here at Georgetown, what resources you're using and how you learned that?
Yeah, definitely. I actually also had a podcast as an assignment during my own time in undergrad, which kind of primed me to begin working on climate history when I arrived at Georgetown in 2019. So I'm really grateful that I was able to have that opportunity, which had familiarized me with audio editing with GarageBand. We, in the before times, would actually have people come to campus frequently, and we would sit around one microphone, or and just chat. And that microphone, inputs right into a laptop, and then you just go in and fix up the audio afterwards. Um, Now I think the podcast has opened up some, the pandemic has opened up some exciting opportunities that, you can chat with so many people via Zoom. They don't have to be in your office in Washington, D.C. But it also means that I don't have audio recording equipment where I am right now. So the audio quality of our podcast has, I would say, decreased a little bit in the past 6 months, because now the I don't have a microphone available to me. So it's a pretty straightforward setup, just to echo what's already been said, that podcasting is so accessible to so many people now. But that's how the mechanics work for us, before and after March 13th or thereabouts.
Great, thanks. We have a couple of other questions from the audience here. This is for our faculty members. How do podcasts play into the traditional scholarly metrics of productivity, such as publications and service? Robynn, would you like to?
I think that we're not quite there yet. I know that it probably wouldn't count as, it'd probably be more at this point, would be like in our little merit review grid, would probably come more into something like service to the community. But I think that it's going to change. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm actually studying the objects, because I'm fascinated by them as objects. But I started out, well, just as a listener, and then I had an emergency in my family 10 years ago and had to go home to Texas. And it was like, how am I going to teach? And recording my lectures was the way. That was kind of my entree in. So I think it's right now, it's a little bit in a gray area. But I'm also in a department of performing arts. And so I would argue that I think it should change, but I think it also depends on what is the purpose of the podcast. Because I think that I make tons of video essays and podcasts just to teach from. But I wouldn't necessarily, I would do them differently were I to put them out as some sort of presentation. But I think that's on the horizon. I just did, in film and media, we always have this problem of presentation. And so you do online journals that have video. Like, how much longer is it going to be before, it is a thing, it is a video essay instead of just a paper with clips, right? So I think we're in a kind of gray area at the moment from my experience.
Well, that's a pretty hopeful answer. Thank you, Robynn. We have two more questions. I think we have time to get to both of them. Are there classes like Professor McNamer's Ignatius Seminar that delve into podcast creation that are open to students in their later years at Georgetown?
Well, I would just say that this experience has inspired me to create the podcast as an option for other classes I will be teaching. So, for example, this coming spring, I'm teaching a class that's a world literature class, and I will be offering podcasts as an option there. So, and that's for upper class students. So that is one answer, but I do think that there are more professors doing podcasts than we know about. So that might be worth just when you're reading course descriptions to see if the word comes up, because I think more of my colleagues are using them.
Thank you. And I'll put the link into the chat in just a moment, but in the library's showcase, where we showcase works by students across all media that have used resources from the library, there is a whole section on podcasts, which I'll put in there, and that will give you an idea of some other classes that have used podcasting as an assignment option. So our last question here is, I'm also curious as to why, if the subject is a piece of art, you would choose a podcast as opposed to having them create a video.
Oh, go ahead.
Robynn?
I was just going to say, I kind of don't make a distinction in my mind between video essay and podcast. It's like, what do I need to get across? And I do both of them, and students do both of them. But I would also go back to that idea of, there's something about having that image removed that allows you to think of it. Now, I think you obviously at some point you engage with the visual image of a piece of art or a piece of sculpture or something like that in particular. But there is something about starting to talk about it before or even after that engagement where that's removed. We do that with music all the time, and I think it's actually really enlightening because we can't yell over Beethoven. And I think that that's actually really useful.
I would add that manuscripts provide an interesting test case of some of these issues, in that there are quite a few illustrated manuscripts, which come across as very visual, right? There are all these images illustrating the text, and but it's clear that in a lot of contexts, a deliberate decision was made to leave images out so that the reader could imagine the scenes. And so there is something about listening to something or reading a text and doing the image making in one's own mind that a physical image can actually constrain. So that's another potential answer there, that there is something to be gained even visually by taking away the visual component because of the image making capacities of the mind.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We don't have any more questions in the Q&A. So I just want to thank everybody for their participation, their insights. This has been really interesting, engaging, and I think we've got a lot of ideas to consider for the future for teaching, learning, and research here. And Nicoletta, did you want to close the program?
Thank you so much. I add my gratefulness to yours, really to all the panelists and the wonderful moderator for this very rich and inspiring conversation, which hopefully has allowed us to appreciate a variety of attitude, perceptions, and reported uses of podcasts in our community. I was taking notes throughout the conversation. Many interesting things came up. We can say that podcasts are intuitively attractive, but when the moment comes maybe to produce one on our own, the task seems daunting, especially if we don't see ourselves as tech savvy. Hopefully our colleagues' experiences will encourage us to give it a try, using also the resources that, as we see also from the chat, are available at the library. So definitely let's give it a try. Maybe as a summarizing final thought, we don't want to go so far as to echo Marshall McLuhan's famous claim that the medium is the message, but certainly this new medium plays a relevant role. We have seen if we want to say, in making the humanities narratives more accessible, even democratizing them, if you want. Podcast technology, we have seen, can be a valuable method for both students and scholars to construct interdisciplinary knowledge and deliver material in a very interactive, accessible, multisensory, we have learned, imaginative fashion, and can provide indeed interesting opportunities to reach a broader audience also beyond our campus. So once again, thank you so much for attending. Please keep following us. You can also leave messages, comments, suggestions for future programs or invited speakers by using the suggestion box available on the website of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative, or you can write us at humanitiesgu@georgetown.edu. So once again, thank you to all of you, both participants and audience, and good night. See you in November, hopefully. Take care. Thank you.